body of research that the Beam Exchange has been commissioning over the past 2 years to support new ideas and encourage better decision making in our field. The research aims to fill knowledge gaps by linking theory to practical experience. So it should demonstrate what theoretical insights mean for practice and complement theory with empirical evidence and practical learning. Now, most of this research that the Beam has commissioned in the past 2 years has been co-created with practitioners rather than academic institutions. And those practitioners have been selected through a competitive application process. So I'm very happy to introduce this morning a team from Maxwell Stamp who started work on a piece of work for Beam in February. The core of that team are 3 people: James Keddy, Steen van Hummelen, and James Blewett. But they're also collaborating with more than 10 programs across the world, 3 continents, and various economic sectors. So let me tell you a little bit as a way of introduction about what the research is aiming to do. It's been examining intervention design and implementation procedures in market systems development programs. And in particular, it's been looking at what kind of pre-investment analysis is undertaken by programs to test business ideas that the program intends to implement. They want to understand if and how a good pre-investment analysis leads to more success in facilitating market systems change and, as a result, in generating beneficial impacts for people living in poverty at a significant scale. The research findings are going to be published by the end of this year, so this webinar is an intermediate step in the research. The research will be published as a research report, but it will also produce a practical toolkit for people like yourselves that aims to help programs conduct better pre-intervention analysis and devise strategies for getting to scale. So the purpose of today's webinar in particular is to present these preliminary findings, exchange ideas with you, and describe the structure and the contents of the planned toolkit. Before I hand over to James Blewett, I just want to flag up a couple of features on this platform that we're using for Beam webinars, so Adobe Connect. In particular, you'll see that there's a chat box in the bottom right-hand corner of the screen, and this is where you can exchange information, either or questions or notes, with anyone else in the webinar, or with everyone as a whole. So you can either put messages in to the general chat box for everyone, or if you want to communicate directly with one individual, you can, if you right-click next to their name above, you can select to start a private chat. We are very keen to get your questions. We already had a lot of questions submitted as part of the registration process, which is great. Thank you very much. But if you have further questions that come to you during the course of the webinar, please put them in the chat box. We will monitor that during the course of the presentation, and after the presentation by James, which will last about 20-25 minutes, we hope we'll have plenty of time to discuss those questions and put them to James or any of the other presenters. Okay, so let me hand over to James. James, by the way, is the Economic Policy and Strategy Practice Leader at Maxwell Stamp. He has a background in corporate finance and over 20 years experience in international development, most in recent years focusing on market systems development. He was formerly the General Manager of Catalyst in Bangladesh, and he also led the team that designed and implemented the Afghanistan Business Innovation Fund. So very, very privileged to introduce James.
Thank you very much, Mike, and good morning to everybody, and thank you for joining the webinar. I'm going to be leading the presentation over the next hour or so, but as Mike said, I'm just one member of a team, and I'll introduce quickly those other members who are present this morning. Dr. James Keddy, who is the lead researcher, and Sten van Hummelen, who's been working alongside me on some of the analysis, data collection analysis. So, over the next hour or so, this is how it's going to work. We'll have a quick introduction, then we're going to talk about issues around program strategy and design, and we'll drill down a bit into pre-intervention investment analysis, wrap up with a few conclusions and some next steps, and then there'll be time for questions and answers at the end. And thank you very much to everybody who has sent questions in advance. It's been very interesting to sort of get a sense of what people's particular take is on this subject. So the introduction, right? The Beam Exchange Research Project, it really originated from the hypothesis that market systems development, and I'll use the word MSD programs, learn from the world of commercial investment management. We had in mind that we could help ourselves to increase intervention success rates if we were to apply the kind of tools and the techniques used by private investors when they're taking their investment decisions. So this presentation is based on the early findings from our work on two research questions. The first looks at what pre-investment analysis is currently being used by MSD programs. And the second asks whether there is some sort of relationship between the pre-intervention investment analysis and interventions eventually achieving impact at scale. As Mike said, there are 10 programs actively participating in the research, and for confidentiality reasons, we're not in a position to name those programs at this stage. Only when we have their final consent or their decision as to whether they want to be named will we be able to do that, and that will be in the final research report. But we are extremely grateful to them, and they know who they are. Yeah, thank you very much to them. There are 3 from Africa, 5 from Asia, and one each from Europe and the Middle East. We've completed our field visits, and we're currently ploughing our way through huge quantities of data, trying to make sense of it all. And in the end, we think that we will end up with something like 30 interventions, which will be used as the basis for our final research report. But we're 4 months into this process, and we think that we've made enough progress on the data analysis to be able to share some of the early findings. Alongside this research, we're working, as Mike said, on a pre-intervention investment analysis toolkit, which is targeted at practitioners. The toolkit will contain some specific ideas on how program design and implementation processes and techniques could be strengthened in order to increase the chances of interventions achieving impact at scale. And the draft toolkit, just to be absolutely clear, is intended for programs that are trying to facilitate private sector investment in innovative business models by target beneficiaries as well as by intervention partners. But before we dive into our findings and describe some of the toolkit contents, we'd like to take a couple of minutes to look at the definition of impact at scale and introduce the concept of the market frontier, which we found to be relevant to understanding why some interventions have and some have not achieved impact at scale. So first of all, defining the impact, what we mean by impact at scale. There are 2 principal characteristics that distinguish an intervention that is achieving impact at scale. What we mean by impact at scale. So 2 characteristics. First of all, we will see evidence of adaptation and expansion beyond the initial adoption phase. And what this means is that private sector market players with significant market share are actually investing their own resources in the new business model or in recognizable variants of it. The business model that's been promoted by the intervention, and as a result, Beyond the original intervention, a large number of the program's target beneficiary group, particularly indirect beneficiaries, is able to participate in market systems from which they were previously excluded, or alternatively, their economic position within the market system is significantly improved. And those interventions that can be said to have achieved and embedded systemic change are also likely to provoke some kind of responsive or complementary investment with others around the actual intervention itself. But the important thing is that at each stage, moving up this y-axis in the diagram in front of you, and expanding the circle, the bubble on the right, top right corner, requires increasing levels of private investment, both by firms and by target beneficiaries. And this is why we think that we do a bit of our own adaptation and borrow from the world of commercial investment management. Our experience and the research findings indicate that many MSD programs have completed successful pilots, but many of these pilots remain pilots in terms of impact, while some that's indicated by the right arrow, the perpetual pilot, if you like, whereas the green arrow shows this moving up towards scale with increasing investment as we go along. So after defining what we mean by impact at scale, we'd like to introduce the concept of the market frontier. And we think that this idea can help us to understand why some market interventions remain at the pilot stage and why others progress more satisfactorily. So if we start off with the market, any market at the top here, the market frontier basically defines the space within which MSD interventions can work, where they have the potential to achieve impact at scale. And conversely, it shows that there are circumstances where market interventions simply cannot work. The research findings, together with our experience and observations of different types of programs, point to three foundations which we consider necessary for firms or individuals to participate in any given market system. First of those is capital, and by this we mean the quality and quantity of the public and private, the physical and financial assets which determine the productive potential. Secondly, we have capacity, and by this we mean the level of skills and knowledge and the ability of groups of firms or individuals to organize themselves at a local level, and this determines the amount of value that can be extracted from the capital, from the assets, or added to the primary production. And thirdly, we have connections, by which we mean the functionality of networks which determines the transaction potential. In other words, is it physically possible and commercially viable to purchase inputs or take products to market? Now, the presence or absence of capital, capacity, and connections is not binary. Accumulation of each is a process in which we think there is a tipping point, and that is the point at which the alignment of the foundations is sufficient to allow market participation, and we refer to this tipping point as the market frontier. So when it comes to designing market development strategies, it's important to understand both the position of firms and target beneficiaries relative to the market frontier and the various factors that determine that position. Because if they're within the market frontier, then we can reasonably use market-based market development approaches. Beyond the market frontier, then they're going to be reliant on some sort of non-market support, and market development interventions are unlikely to succeed in themselves. So what we've seen is a number of MSD programs that have attempted to reach target beneficiary groups who are clearly beyond the market frontier. And these seem to be the interventions that are destined to fail. On the other hand, we have seen mixed livelihoods and markets approaches that distinguish between, let's say, asset transfers on one hand, as a means to help target beneficiaries to cross the market frontier. And they've then, on the other hand, used market interventions to consolidate the gains that have been made. So we intend to look at this concept in more detail as we develop the toolkit, but we introduce it now because it appears to provide some quite fundamental insights into why some market interventions succeed and others fail. So having defined impacts at scale, introduced the concept of the market frontier, we now turn to how we believe our research findings and recommendations can be applied in practice. It soon became apparent, and here we just have a fairly standard program strategy, design and implementation timeline, if you like, and we're going to show how our approach fits into that in a minute. So it soon became apparent from our research that there were issues with intervention success rates coming out of program design and strategy as much as implementation. The process and associated tools that we're designing therefore intended to help practitioners both during the design and the implementation stages of programs and interventions. For the program strategy and design phase, we're working on tools that can be used as a basis for a private sector engagement strategy and a program value assessment framework. We'll look at all of these in a bit more detail in a few minutes. And then during the program implementation phase, we're developing tools to support pre-intervention investment analysis. So we'll now summarize our key research findings at the program strategic level, and then we'll link those findings to recommendations that we hope will help to incorporate considerations of impact at scale in the program strategy and design process. So there are two main findings from the research that relate to how we approach and engage with the private sector during design and implementation. First is to do with strategic positioning, and we found significant variations in the scope and quality of strategic planning at the sector level during the design process, and we found, we have to say, little robust consideration of scale potential, and as a result, targets which were adopted were frequently unrealistic and subject to subsequent reduction. The second finding here is about understanding the private sector perspective, and I think generally speaking, program designs demonstrate a much stronger understanding of and emphasis on development target group needs than they do on commercial issues and on investment decision-making processes. The other two findings relate to what we refer to as the program value assessment framework, and specifically about how results are contextualized and reported. So the first of these is to do with results reporting, and find that despite very best efforts by all of the programs that we interacted with, transparent and comprehensive reporting was rare, and we found it quite difficult to track and understand value for money from readily available data. The other thing that we might say on this subject is that we think that when we're talking about value for money from these kind of interventions, it needs to be sought and assessed on a whole portfolio basis. Clearly, it will vary from market to market and even more from intervention to intervention. And because there tends to be a focus at an intervention level, few programs have really been able to consistently develop and learn from winners, drop or amend low performers, or find themselves willing to report failures as well as successes. So now we're going to turn to each of these findings in turn. The first concerns the strategic positioning. So the starting point for market development programs is that poor people are excluded or significantly disadvantaged in markets. And this is the situation donors want to address. The poor people have unmet needs. And on the other side, private sector firms with the potential to offer profitable products or services that could answer those needs, somehow or other the two are not coming together. So the MSD intervention challenge is to identify and build the intersection of the donor's development objectives and the intervention partner's commercial interests. The intersection is where sustainable development change as a foundation to impact at scale can happen. However, we found that in a number of cases, there were elements of the program strategy and design which actually reduced the program's ability to find this intersection. And there are two sort of main categories of issues that we found. First is about restricted intervention options. Some program designs limited options by including predefined solutions or excluding viable solutions to target beneficiary needs. We observed programs which were failing to find intervention partners or essentially were paying for partners to do something that the program wanted them to do. Such restrictions imposed by design limit program responsiveness to the realities of the supply side of markets and their flexibility to respond to emerging opportunities. On the other hand, so that's sort of pulling things away in one direction, pulling in the other direction is restricted or limited target beneficiary groups. Now, clearly the strategic focus of MSD programs is on poor people. We did find examples of really very, very restrictive definitions of who should be in the target beneficiary group or the profile of the target beneficiary group, sometimes, let's say, by gender or by geographical location. And those definitions, that limited definition, in turn limited the potential to find intervention partners that were willing to invest in business models targeting such specific customer segments. So our second main finding is about understanding the private sector perspective. And it's worth saying, just to re-emphasize, that this applies not only to intervention partners at firms, but also to the target beneficiaries themselves. So achieving sustainable change and impact at scale using market-based intervention requires that firms and individuals invest alongside the development agency. They will be taking risk and they will be allocating limited resources. And if we, as the development agent, if you like, if we want them to allocate some of their resources in a particular way, we need to look at our preferred option in the context of the investment decision-making criteria used by our co-investors when they're making their investment decisions. So while we found that there is always consideration of whether there are potentially profitable business opportunities, this is not entirely sufficient. And here I'd just quickly like to show three potential projects that we're trying to promote, all of which are perfectly profitable. But when we start to look at not just at profitability, but when we also look at the return on investment that they're going to generate, we will see that project A, in this case, does not actually reach the hurdle rate of return on investment that an investor would demand, which means that it's automatically rejected. And whilst project B and project C do achieve the hurdle rate, clearly the rate of return achieved by project C is greater than project B, so that given that we're allocating scarce resources, the project C would be preferred to project B. This all comes down to risk and return and to opportunity costs. So then we would like to move on to this program value assessment framework. Now, although the area of value assessment is not directly part of our research project, we have findings related to how programs report and contextualize their results, which we think are relevant to the issue of impact at scale. So we'd like to turn to two areas related to the key question of value for money. The first is about results reporting, an issue which is never far away from the hearts and minds of MSD programs. Among the programs participating in this research, it was clear that considerable effort had gone into developing approaches and methodologies that allow timely and credible results reporting. However, we found that at a strategic level, there were significant issues with results reporting frameworks. The first one we refer to as completeness of value reporting. Basically, results frameworks tended to underplay or sometimes ignore the indirect effects of intervention, either in terms of the adaptive investment by the original intervention partner or expansion by competitors, or by the indirect beneficiary, in terms of indirect beneficiary development outcomes. Secondly, the completeness of the for money reporting. It has to be said that we found very few cases where results frameworks have been designed to capture and trace all of the investment costs of a market intervention through to the benefits arising from that intervention. And finally, there was an issue with the credibility of reported results. Few programs had results frameworks that allowed impact claims to be substantiated by reference to convincing quantitative or qualitative evidence. So it's hard to see how we can talk convincingly about value for money at a strategic level when we don't really have a complete picture of either the value or the costs associated with a market intervention. And secondly, we cannot back up our claims with convincing evidence. Moving on to the portfolio approach. The portfolio approach really recognizes that value assessment question is not so much about whether every intervention works, but rather whether a number of interventions taken together generate the kind of results that justify the total program investment. We think that it's more helpful to look across a portfolio of interventions than to assess value on an intervention by intervention basis for three main reasons. First, programs often use multiple interventions to achieve a single market system change. And secondly, even with the best strategic planning in the world, not all interventions will go according to plan and some will fail. So using a portfolio approach basically explicitly acknowledges that some interventions are more likely to work than others, and some market systems will respond more than others to those interventions. And we think this would help with implementation risk management. Well, and then thirdly, while we invest in market systems interventions because we believe they will achieve results, we think that a portfolio approach would help to, let's say, mitigate the shame in reporting individual intervention failure by placing it in the context of whole program results. We think that this would help to improve our evidence base and our ability to learn from experience. So that sort of finishes it at the strategic level, and we'd now like to move from strategy and design into the implementation. Many of the points that we've covered at a strategic level also apply at the intervention level, but of course the analysis will be at a more detailed level. And to help support that analysis, we're developing this practitioner's toolkit. As we said, this is very much work in progress, but we would like to introduce some of the contents to you and invite your feedback on our ideas. So first of all, we're going to look at pre-intervention investment analysis and the research findings that are relevant. Sorry, I beg your pardon. First of all, just to explain and remind ourselves again where this fits into the process. So we've now moved on to the project implementation side and looking at the pre-intervention investment analysis box. So the research findings, at the intervention level, there were several factors which tended to success at scale. Is the importance of the scale agent, there's the convincing profitability of the core business model, and that means to all the relevant market players. And then there's the low entry investment costs, particularly in operating the business model. And then other factors were that kind of associated with failure at scale, complex business models, restricted access to finance, and reliance on a slender evidence base. So, assuming that the program design is conducive to achieving impact at scale, the next step in the process is this pre-intervention investment analysis. And we're now going to talk quickly through 4 tools that we are in the process of developing. I think to start off with, whether a program is providing financial or non-financial support, or a combination of both, the program itself is an investor in the proposed business model, and it's most likely to achieve a return on its investment when it conducts rigorous pre-investment due diligence. So when we're looking at a business idea, we have to narrow it down so that we apply our own program resources in the most efficient way, or the most effective way. So the most successful MSD programs regard the intervention partner and the target beneficiaries as co-investors in an investment project in the business idea. We've identified 3 dimensions that successful programs considered as part of due diligence process for any joint investment. The first of these is the project due diligence, which really looks at the commercial viability of the idea. There are lots of business ideas out there, not all of which are commercially viable. It's important that we select those which are most likely to be viable. So we're asking questions about its viability and whether it can be reasonably expected to deliver value to our target beneficiary consumer or customer, as well as a sustainable and acceptable profit margin for the intervention partner. The next step, once we've discovered that it has a reasonable chance of being commercially viable, is to look at whether it's scalable. And this means looking at a kind of people due diligence. And by people, we're talking about our target beneficiaries. So is the proposed investment project scalable, either by the intervention partner and or by the partner's competitors? Does the product or service envisaged by the proposed business model, is it affordable, is it relevant, is it credible to large numbers of the program target beneficiaries? And then finally, if it passes all of those hurdles, we then look at the partner themselves and whether they are investable. Do they have or are they able to access the financial and managerial resources? Do they have the market presence and reputation necessary to implement it successfully? And most importantly, is the partner ready and willing to accept the risk exposure and commit the necessary resources to the project themselves? So that's the first tool. The second one concerns scale agents and routes to scale. And here is quite a complicated diagram, but what it's trying to show is that we have left the partner enterprises, maybe one, maybe more, which is receiving support from the donor project. On the right, we have target beneficiaries, and then we need some kind of distribution or aggregation network that connects the two, so that demand can flow in one direction and supply can flow in the other. So by scale agent, the partner enterprise, I mean is an intervention partner that either has sufficiently dominant market position. For example, let's say a mobile phone provider would be typically one of a fairly small number of such providers. Do they have that dominant market position to deliver impact at scale? Or there are competitors who, together with the intervention partner, have the capacity to scale up the proposed business model. And then by route to scale, we mean the infrastructure through which the product or service can be distributed to the target beneficiary group. And of course, the same applies in reverse, talking about aggregation rather than distribution. For a physical product, this route to scale would typically be a network of wholesalers and retailers. And for a virtual product, the route to scale will be a mobile phone network. The scale agent will not necessarily own or even control the route to scale, but it is imperative that the scale agent has sustainable access to the route to scale. So that's the second tool, and behind each of these there will be a diagnostic tool, an analytical tool that can be used to assess the strength, the presence and strength of each of the components that we're talking about. So the third thing that we would like to look at is about affordability, relevance, and credibility. It's a kind of assessment tool. And here we're really looking at things from the point of view of the target beneficiary. So the questions that this tool asks and helps you to discern is, first of all, whether the product service is affordable to the target beneficiary population. Secondly, is it relevant to their felt needs? And thirdly, is it credible to the target beneficiary population? We're asking them to take a big risk, and we need to be convincing that our solution is one that's going to work for them. So that's the third tool. And then finally, we would like to come on to fourth tool that we have in our toolkit. And here you will see a variation on the very familiar M4P donut. We've added in a third segment. Because this is because analyzing all of the other conditions is necessary, but not sufficient to the pre-intervention investment analysis process. The elephant in the room, if you like, to achieving impact at scale is finance. Without finance, even the most commercially viable, the most scalable, the most investable investment project will not get off the ground, let alone achieve impact at scale. So we want to go beyond the who does and who pays question around the core transaction to also ask who invests, when do they get paid, and who's going to provide the affordable finance within the intended market system. And so we've looked at what we think to be two equally important aspects of the question of finance. The first one is investment capital, and the second is working capital. I'm very happy to talk about those in more detail later on. But the kind of analysis that we would do when looking at the finance segment in the market system is very much finance applied to that particular market system. So you can see here the kind of questions that we would ask relating to investment capital and working capital from the point of view of, let's say, the firm level intervention partner and from the point of view of the target beneficiary. And that's the fourth tool and where we're at the moment. So quick conclusions, basically two deliverables. There's a research report, practitioner's toolkit. Research report will be a public document published through the Beam Exchange. The practitioner's toolkit will be a proprietary piece, which will be available along with supporting training for program designers and implementers. We welcome comments, feedback, not just through the question and answers session now, but also we'd like to invite anybody who has any later thoughts to contact us, and you can see my name and Sten's name down at the bottom of this slide, and you can write to us at research@maxwellstamp.com. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, James. That was fascinating and very engaging. We've had quite a few questions. I think because we've only got 20 minutes left, I'm going to go straight into those questions. And they start with some sort of definitions of terminology, I guess, and concepts. So there's a set of questions we received about what we mean by scale and what are the basic conditions for scale. So Willie Mylud from Christian Aid asked, how do you calculate scale, and is it always about direct profit beneficiaries? Peter Gombo wants to know, is systemic change the same as the felt need of would-be beneficiaries? And Boyega Ilusanya would like to know, what are the basic conditions or criteria to even consider a scaling up process? James, are you still with us?
Do you hear me?
Yes, sorry, we haven't heard you. We can hear you now.
Okay, good. Sorry, we lost you halfway through that, but I think I heard some of the questions. So I think what we tried to make clear from our definition of impact at scale is that it is very much about indirect beneficiaries. I think if we only talk about direct beneficiaries, then we're losing a lot of the richness of the market systems development approach, and I think that we're underselling ourselves as well. So I think, yes, it's very much about indirect beneficiaries, and also, let's say, about indirect investment behaviors by competitors or by non-competitive firms in the market system. So particularly you can imagine, let's say, an agri-business enterprise doing something with farmers, smallholder farmers, and then a bank might step in to offer a tailored financial product that helps the smallholder farmer to finance their working capital. So it can be non-competitive as well as competitive investment. Could you tell me what the second question was, please, Mike? Sorry.
Well, yes, James. So the second question was, is systemic change the same as the felt need of would-be beneficiaries? I guess what Peter Gombo is trying to get at is the degree to which our kind of goals are aligned with the needs of poor people living in poverty. I guess it sometimes feels like the focus is more on the sort of left-hand side of your Venn diagram on finding solutions that work for companies, and shifting too much of the focus away from the needs of people living in poverty.
I think that the two are reconcilable. I think I've seen plenty of commercially viable and investable business models which do provide products or services which are very much tailored to the needs of target beneficiary groups. I think the danger is that the emphasis is placed too much either on one or on the other. Clearly, if we sacrifice a focus on the target beneficiary in the pursuit of overemphasis on commercial considerations, then that leads to one problem and vice versa. So I think that the two can be reconciled. Although it has to be said that there are some programs or some interventions clearly which have been skewed in one direction or the other, and as a result, not achieved, let's say, the developmental impact at scale that was intended for them.
Can I also ask you about the concept of market frontier, because that can be understood in different ways. For example, I think some people might intuitively understand the market frontier to be where the market currently reaches to, whereas in your diagram, I think you were trying to suggest the market frontier as being more of a potential frontier of where there is the tipping point where or maybe you should explain it, but I mean, you're looking at the market frontier as something a bit beyond where existing markets reach, and more of where the potential for poor people to be engaged with markets more profitably, more beneficially exists. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, the market frontier is clearly a sort of virtual concept, although it may have physical manifestations. And I think that there are two ways in which our target beneficiary group can cross the market frontier. One is by expanding the market frontier outwards. So in other words, let's say a target beneficiary group which is geographically remote, let's say with infrastructure improvements, might suddenly become a viable customer group or supplier group, whereas previously they were cut off from markets, or through sort of improved distribution and aggregation networks. That's one way you can expand the market frontier outwards. The other way that people can cross the market frontier is by bringing them inwards. So, for example, and this is something that we saw in one of the programs that we looked at, where we were talking about mixed approaches, where there were, say, very poor families really living life beyond the market frontier. And then through a livelihoods-based asset transfer program, they were brought into, let's say, a more sort of market viable situation. You know, they suddenly had the assets to create a critical mass at a community level, which meant that they brought themselves within the market frontier. So I think that it really is a virtual concept, and there are two different ways in which people can cross it.
Okay, thank you. James, I'm going to move us on to the second set of questions, if that's all right. We have had 4 or 5 questions which really relate to the question about what are the skills, capacities and time required to conduct pre-investment analysis. The sort of questions are, to give you an example, Mike Klassen is interested in whether it's how programs can kind of manage the process of building up the capacity of their staff who will be doing intervention design alongside this kind of analysis. Are there any insights on how you might simultaneously train local staff while also doing this kind of pre-investment analysis? Katie Whitehouse is concerned about the challenge, if you like, of the amount of work involved in assessing markets, identifying gaps, collecting data and so on, and whether this can be done within the sort of resources that programs typically have. Olubunmi Thomas simply asks, what percentage of total investment time would you use for pre-investment analysis phase? So it's kind of getting down to the nuts and bolts of it. So any thoughts on that, on these sort of questions, James?
Sure. I think that there is nothing, let's say, hugely technical about any of the tools that we're proposing. I mean, these should be, you know, familiar to people with some kind of background in business or in finance or whatever. So I don't think that there's anything conceptually complicated. I think that the particular skill that I'm sure that many people participating in this webinar have is the ability to see things both from a developmental point of view and a commercial point of view, right? Because really what the trick is to marry the two. And I think that's the particular skill which I think needs to possibly be developed a little bit at a program level. Certainly my experience of working with some people in different programs has been that often people come with one or the other background. There are very few people who actually bring both. So I would say that's the important thing, to not get too stuck in one direction or another, development or commercial, but to bring the two together. How much time and effort should be spent on it? I think that really it's an ongoing process. I mean, the point that we're trying to make is that, you know, as both at the design stage and then in the implementation stage, there are going to be inputs, there are going to be times where this kind of analysis is required. And I would hesitate to put a sort of percentage on it, but I think that you should do it to the point where you feel comfortable making the investment that you're being asked to make. So, I mean, at the end of the day, we're all handling public money, and that's the reason why we use the term due diligence, because it sort of implies the fiduciary responsibility that we have towards our funders. And I think that if we're making a relatively small investment, we would probably do fairly light touch pre-investment analysis. If we're making a larger investment, then clearly we would go into much more detail. So I think the answer is, how much should we do? The answer is enough.
Okay, thank you very much for that.
we've only got a few minutes left, so I'm going to move on to the third set of questions that people have put forward. Again, apologies for those of you who I'm mashing your questions into a kind of aggregated question, but there have been various people who have raised the problem of working in very thin or fragile markets. And the question really is around how the kind of processes you've been describing need to be adapted in the light of that. How do you achieve scale in a small economy with thin markets? How do you assess, if you like, the overall economic environment, and how does that affect the kind of processes that you might adopt to do this kind of pre-investment analysis?
I think the market frontier concept is probably quite useful when we're looking at thin markets, because I think that allows us to understand why the market is thin. You know, is it thin because it's literally impossible for it to develop, right? There is something inherent in the circumstances that prevents a market from developing, or is it thin because nobody's yet moved into an opportunity that does exist? So I would say that we have seen really quite significant examples of programs which are trying to implement market systems development interventions in very thin markets, right? And what became sort of apparent to them and to us as we were reading their reporting was that these were interventions which were almost destined to fail in the particular circumstances in which they were being implemented, because the market was so thin. And the reason it was thin was not because it could be strengthened and developed. It was thin because it wasn't the right market for that particular place or that particular time.
Can you give any practical examples of these? Either from your research or from other work that programs are doing you're aware of.
Okay, I can't from the research again because of confidentiality issues, but I'm giving an example from my sort of personal experience. One of the things we tried to do in Afghanistan was to develop the mining services market. And, you know, Afghanistan, very sort of promising minerals and mineral resources, and apparently great promise for an extractive industry to develop. And you would imagine that there would be potential for supporting services to develop alongside. So we focused on the support services side of things. But then because of, let's say, because of sort of regulatory uncertainty, political confusion, so on and so forth, the sector did not develop at the speed or in the way that anybody anticipated, and the sort of mining services, for example, one of the laboratories that we helped set up, it sort of rapidly adapted and shifted from trying to do mining services to doing sort of agricultural services like soil testing and what have you. So not all was lost, but I think that's an example of a thin market, which was somehow, it wasn't thin because the services were not there. It was thin because of a much bigger regulatory issue that was simply preventing it from happening. And it may well be that circumstances change and that the time comes in the future when something can happen, but for now it can't. So that would be an example of a thin market because it's simply impossible for it to exist.
Okay, thank you. Now it's been we are officially scheduled to wind up at on the hour in 3 minutes, but we think because there's so many questions that are of such interest, we're going to just push it a few more minutes over. So we're going to carry on until about 5 past, just so everyone knows. The next. I'm tempted to carry on this area, but we've had a couple of interesting sort of questions on different topics, and one of them is around the
the role of other partners who aren't private sector investors. I mean, a lot of programs, market systems development programs, are engaging with, to various degrees, with civil society organisations or with government, with local and national governments, and they have a role, I mean, if you like, an investment to be made in systems change themselves. Now, that's maybe a very different kind of investment, but where the question, which is from Maya Rueg, is, are there any analogies, or are there things we can learn from this kind of frameworks and tools that you're developing that could be applied, if you like, to thinking about the investment that public or civil society organisations have to make in market systems change?
I think there probably is. I think that if you're talking about let's say the tools that we are designing to do with understanding the target beneficiaries' needs and capabilities, I think those are as relevant to, let's say, public investment as they are to private investment. I think that the same sort of issues about sorry, I'm just trying to think. The same issues around the allocation of scarce resources apply, although clearly it might not be the return on investment that's driving the allocation. It might be more about political considerations, or political return, if you like, rather than financial return. So I suspect that a program would need to look at that in a different way, but fundamentally it's the same sort of thought. I would also say that if we're looking at the whole idea of, let's say, a public sector organisation acting as a scale agent, a very sort of typical example of that might be a public agricultural extension service. And one of the things that you would be looking at is the quality and the strength of the network that links, let's say, a central Ministry of Agriculture down through provincial government, down to field office level or something like that. So I haven't, to be honest, I haven't really thought about this, Mike. But as I do now think about it, I think that there could be some relevance in what we're doing, and I'd be very happy to take that up as an issue afterwards with the person who's asked the question.
Well, that's okay. That's great. So that was Myra Egg, by the way. So I'm sure I've pronounced your surname wrong, Maya. But I'll send you the link if you don't know her already. Okay, one or two other other sort of disconnected questions. But Julia Delforce was curious to know whether the 10 programs that are collaborating with you, whether any of them have adopted the DCD results measurement framework, and if they have, does that have any influence on the way they conduct value assessments and your sort of assessment of their performance in this framework?
The answer is that some of them are using the DCD standard. Does it have an effect? I think that it goes some way towards providing some data, but in itself, I think our sort of joint conclusion, I'm looking at James Kelly across the table here, looking for confirmation or otherwise, but I would say that our joint conclusion is that it is useful, but it is not sufficient as a means for assessing value for money from market development programs. I think the points that we make about the sort of portfolio approach is something which I think extends or builds on the DCD standard, and I think that the idea of looking at looking at indirect costs, indirect costs or whole costs and indirect benefits is something which that goes beyond what the DCD standard allows for.
You said, you mentioned 1%.
Yeah. And we would place a much stronger emphasis, and we would say that that's actually a much more important result of and market development intervention than the direct costs and direct benefits which are emphasised in the DCED standard.
Okay, thank you very much. That's really great. James, I've found this a very enjoyable webinar. It's been really great hearing you talk about your research, and I for one, am extremely excited to see the final report, which will come out towards the end of this year. Can I just say thanks to everybody who's joined? I hope you found this interesting. Bear in mind that this webinar will be available on the Beam website afterwards, and so you can forward a link to it to any of your colleagues or friends who weren't able to join us. We've also got various links to resources that have been flagged up by my colleague Sarah in the chat box. So please have a look at the chat box and see various links to resources related to this webinar that will you can go straight to from the chat box. And Sarah has also flagged up, and this is hugely important for us. There is a survey. It would be great if you could just complete that survey quickly. It take you no more than a minute, just to let us know what you thought about this webinar, how well it went, and what we can do to improve the delivery of the webinars that we offer at the Beam Exchange. With that note, I want to say a huge thank you to James again, and wish you all well and have a great day.
Thanks, Mike. And thank you to everybody who's participated from our side as well. Thank you.
Goodbye.